Well, hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the first video in the F15 build series. All this got dropped off yesterday. We got some boxes up in the mezzanine from when the previous stuff was dropped off. So we've got everything in the garage now and we are ready to start the build of the FB Jets F15 airplane. I know a bunch of you guys have been waiting for this, so let's roll the intro and we will get started on this build. All right, guys, so the way my process kind of works with a plane like this is initially I just need to wrap my head around what needs to be done. So I think the very first step is I'm going to pull the airframe out of the box, and I think what I'm going to start on is the engines or the hot section of the plane, getting the pipes and everything lined up. Reason for that is once we have that stuff done, then we can move on to the other portions of the airplane, obviously, and we can start working our way forward. So we may do the engines, elevators. Obviously, if you've watched my channel before, you know things change as my brain figures things out and we modify the installation process. So step number one, I'm going to open this box up. The fuselage is buried in the bottom, but we're going to yank the fuselage out, get it on the build table, and go from there. As a little side note here, guys, we do have a full set of Revic bags coming for this plane that the owner ordered from the website, thelightersideofrc.com. There's a link down below. And also the F18 in the background, the big one that we built on the channel before. There is a full set of Revic bags coming for that plane. So if you need some Revic bags or you need the best plane bags in the industry, check out the website when you're done watching this video, and I can definitely help you out getting those all sorted. There we go. Whew. That was a good workout. All right, so a couple things that I'll mention to you guys that if you've watched my builds before, you know how important this is. But the owner, number one, has gone in and removed the landing gear and Loctited everything. So that's done. I don't need to do that, but remember that does need to get done. So any metal to metal bolts, things like that, you need to make sure you Loctite, super important. So Chad's gone in and done that. The other thing he's done is he's treated all the formers. Now the formers in this plane, they're all laminated with carbon fiber, but the edges are all exposed on the woodwork. So he's gone in, you can see the shiny finish there. He's gone in and epoxied all of the exposed wood. So that step's done as well. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to remove all the parts out of the aircraft, and there's tons of stuff in there. And then we'll get that stuff kind of set aside. So what I'm going to do is he wants to keep the box, so we're just going to be tossing all of the bubble wrap and stuff inside the box, but we'll use the box to lay all of our parts out because it's there, and it's like a big massive work table. All right, guys, so I got most of the parts and everything kind of unpacked and laid out here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on the engine mounting. The pipes fit in there, and there's lots of space, but they actually get supported by the cones. So those formers that are in the cones are too big. So these will need to be sanded down to fit the profile of the pipe. We're not going to worry about that right now. And we're not going to worry about this back section right now. The first thing we're going to worry about is getting the engine rails mounted and everything. But before we do any of that, we want to make sure that we seal off any of these air nipples, because if we're sanding the carbon and the dust and the wood and stuff like that, and you get any of that in the air valve, it can definitely cause premature failure of the air valves. The other thing I like to do on these kits is I like to put some silicone oil, just some silicone shock oil, inside these air valves when we get to them. So I'm not going to do that right now, but I am going to take a little piece of airline and just stick it over top of the nipple and then heat and melt the end, just so that's taken care of and we don't need to worry about getting anything in those. And we're going to do the same thing on the gear. I'm just going to melt this end and then you just squish it down with pliers. So I'm going to do that, and then we will focus on the engine rails. All right, guys, so there's two different size engine rails here. So if you look at these two, you'll have a wide one and a narrow one, and they're quite a bit different shapes. So what I figured out is the smaller engine rail goes on the bottom, the wider one goes on the top. So these are going to be a little bit tricky to get in. They're a nice tight fit. I suppose you could just use the screws to hold everything together, because there's screws on the bottom piece here, whatever you want to call that. And there's also top pieces as well, like this guy right here. So you could conceivably, I guess, put this all together and not use any glue, but we are going to glue these engine rails into the formers. So what I'm going to do is just make sure both sides fit, and then we're going to use Hysol 9462, and we are just going to glue those in and let those guys sit until they're cured tomorrow. All right, guys, so we've got all of our pieces fit, sanded, ready to go. I did take my file and sharpen the corners here, because they had quite a half circle in the inside corners, probably from the machining process. So taking a file and just sharpening those corners makes them fit a lot better. So I've got all 4 of those pieces ready to go, and we're going to glue those in, and we'll have to let that sit overnight. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we've got bolts holding on the former pieces here that hold the rails on. So what do you do on that case? You got to Loctite them. So I've taken out all these bolts, put blue Loctite on them, snug them up nicely, and we are ready to go. So I'm going to get this glued in. I'll show you the final product. All right, so just taking a look at some of the hardware here, guys. The servo mounts, they all came pre-assembled. So nice mounts. But all the other hardware came labeled. So really nice touch. Canopy, screws for plates, screws for missiles. These are going to be for the elevators with your spacers there. Screw for stabilizers, screw for fins, screw for fuselage, screw for wings. So nice touch. And they did also include some Allen keys. You don't see that very often. And then of course the actual surface ball joints and everything were all pre-assembled, which is great. And so that's the hardware package that comes with the plane. You can see some of the other hardware stuff here, but yeah, it all looks good. All right, guys, engine rails have been glued in place. So everything worked out well. The one thing I didn't show you is just make sure you sand the carbon where it's actually interfacing with the former that it's going into. Just give it a light scuff with sandpaper, and everything is glued. So as I've talked about before, we've got a little bit of Hysol left over. Always have something in mind to use the rest of your material, right? Better than having it go to waste. So I'm going to try and zoom in here, but as I was going over the plane, if you look at that air valve or air cylinder holder right there at the tip of my finger, it's only glued on one side. So I'm going to use my leftover Hysol and just glue it on the side that's facing us. And it's the same thing on both sides of the fuselage. So we'll get the opportunity to use the rest of that Hysol. All right, so we have set the fuselage aside to let those engine rails cure. And now we're moving on to the rudders or vertical stabs and working some things out here. So the owner is going with Bluebird servos on the entire plane. Now these are the lowest output servos. They're like 500 ounces or something like that. There's the specs on them if you can see them. So at 8.4 volts, yeah, 500 ounces, 495.9 ounces. So the one thing about these servos compared to the other ones that are in the box is these ones are 1 millimeter smaller than the other Bluebird servos, which hopefully on the other surfaces, these openings are bigger. But anyways, the biggest issue here is depth. So on the trailing edge of the servo opening, we're fairly narrow here, and the only servo that's going to fit in there is going to be this guy because it's 1 millimeter smaller. So it's still a little bit big. It's half a millimeter big, which we can deal with, but when it's a couple millimeters too big, that doesn't work. So the other issue we may run into is when we install these servos in the opening and install the plate, which is also the servo holder, our servo is actually wider than the opening, so we may have to sand just a little bit off the edges of the servo keepers here, which isn't a big deal, but the big deal is just the available travel. So if we do our proper geometry, as we should generally do, there's full servo travel one way and full servo travel the other way. Doesn't work. So we have a couple options here. Option number one, we install the servo tray like that, and we open this up a little bit more because we do have to actually open that up anyways, and maybe we'll get enough travel just by opening this up. So that's what we're going to try first. The other option we have is we can also offset these servos one click. So we get them centered, and then we do one servo spline the other direction, which then centers that servo arm a little bit better in the opening, so we can get not full travel one way because the ball joint would hit the cover. So that's about 3/4, and then we've got about 3/4 the other way before the arm actually would contact. So we've got a little bit of stuff to figure out here with the rudder setup. What I'm going to try first is having proper geometry, sand these things out because we need to do it anyways, and we'll see what happens. Now we do also have to mount our horns in all the surfaces. So what FB has done is they have lined up this little slot in line with the servo opening, which is nice, and then we can make this a little bit bigger with our Dremel to actually fit this guy in there. And then if you actually take the pre-made ball joints and put it up there, we're really stinking close to the right length. So really, really awesome to see that. That's a lot of nice pre-fabrication on their end. So first thing we need to do is we need to do some sanding on these little nubs to actually let the servo fit in. And then we need to mount the servo onto the plate. So and that's a pretty simple process. Basically these pre-made servo mounts screw into the servo, go like this, and we've essentially are good to go. And then we have to do some holes and mount our plates to the covers. So I guess you could glue these in place. Definitely not good, I think, to just trust the glue. And any other FB jets that I've seen, these have actually been bolted on. So okay guys, so we've got the servo all mounted on the plate. Now there's a couple things to consider here. Number one, we screwed the mounting screws right through the plastic. Number two, we're also going to glue these tabs down to the servo plate, and then we're also going to glue the servos to the servo plate with a little strip of shoe goop. So it's going to be a nice rigid mounting point, and it's going to work good. Obviously, we'll touch these up with some gray paint as well too, so they're pretty much invisible. And then the mounting screws for the plate into the surfaces, we will mount those and touch them up with gray paint. So the rudder ones are small compared to the main surfaces. If you look at the main surfaces, they are substantially bigger than the rudder ones there. You can see the outline. So we're about probably about 5 millimeters on both sides. So we will have a lot more room on the main surfaces to get those mounted. So that'll be easier. So the other thing to consider when fitting this in, we talked about the fact that I need to sand this out a little bit. So when this rudder servo is all mounted, you can see that the actual arm is a little bit proud, maybe 0.5 millimeter. And then we've also got our washers here that are sitting a little bit proud too. So we're going to work on that stuff and make the fit a little bit better. It needs to be at or narrower than the actual plate to fit right in, and then we still do need some to do some sanding to make space for that servo to fit in. So I'm going to work on that stuff, but next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the servo off. We'll glue up the arms onto the plate, and then we'll add a little bit of goop on the actual servo and get that all mounted back on. Okay, so servo's been removed, so we'll take some medium CA, drop it in the holes there. And then we'll also just run a bead along the joint. So probably not necessary, but it's nice just to go one step above and beyond. Same thing as putting the shoe goop on the plate here and putting the servo on. I mean, why not? When you look at a mounting system like this, I mean, probably the weakest point is going to be where the bolts holding the actual plate onto the surface, that's probably the weakest point right there. I mean, you can only reinforce this stuff so much. When you think about the way that the aviation design diamond was built with those aluminum servo covers, I mean, that doesn't get much stronger, but at that point you've got these tiny little screws holding the metal plate in. So the weak point there is the screws, right? So you just do your best when dealing with stuff like this. You know, the weak point here is not the screws, but it's maybe the plate, but then they've reinforced it on this side with fiberglass. So should be a nice strong mounting system. I don't see any issues with that, and that'll work good. So I think the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the mounting screws that come with the Bluebird servos. Reason for that is they're a 3mm thread, just like these guys, but the head and the washer is smaller than the ones that come mounted on those plates. And because this is a 3mm thread, it'll thread right into the plastic L-bend piece. All right, guys, well, she is all installed. I ended up sanding the edges down on both sides. You can see the blue tapered washers there, and sanded those down. And just as a safety measure here, I put a 3mm nut on the back. The ones that come with the Bluebird servos have this kind of flange, so I used one on one side that I could fit, and then I just used a standard 3mm lock nut on the other side. So anyways, the servo's all mounted, and sanding this area out, this thing is a tight fit, but it does just fit. So you can see I took quite a bit of material off the sides here, took some off the front edge, and it fits snug, but it does fit. So once we do these bolts up, it will squish the cover down, and our rudder servo will be installed. So definitely a nice snug fit, but it works. So that's awesome. So I'm going to get this one installed, and then we will do the exact same thing on the other surface, the other rudder, and then we are pretty much ready to install our horns as well. All right, and generally you want to protect the wires, guys, when they go through something like this, where you've got possibility of having some fiberglass rubbing on the wires. And so I've put some snakeskin material on there. It comes to just the edge right here. So when we put the verticals on the airframe, this will just tuck in to the pocket there. And our connectors are the one servo connector and the light connector, which is what that small one's for, is for the light that's on the edge of the fin right there. So that is basically done, and now we can fasten this onto the airframe. We're going to use a little bit of blue Loctite again on that because we're going into a metal to metal surface, and get that fastened. All right, guys, we got help in the shop. Chad's helping to assemble his own plane. Make things go quicker. It's nice. Next thing we're doing is, so the other rudder is done. We copied exactly what we did on this guy, so that's all finished. Next thing we're going to do is mount these horns, because we need to let the glue set. So All I've done on this step is just do a nice straight line with tape. So we've got a visual line to follow. Their line that they pre-cut is nice and straight, but we've got to widen that to fit the actual horn in. Now the one thing about the horn is you want to get the pivot point of the horn on the pivot point of the surface as close as possible. And that helps your geometry with movement in both directions. So we're going to make this hole a little bit, or the slot a little bit closer to the surface most likely, but we're just going to use a Dremel and just widen that existing slot. All right, guys, the pockets for the control horns have been made. The best tool was this Dremel bit here. It's a little bit wider than the actual pocket needs to be, which is perfect. It's a little bit deceiving when you go through the hardwood block that's installed, because if you look really closely at that one, it looks like you've gone through the surface, but you've actually just gone into the little bump of the fiberglass skin. So anyways, both of those are done. We're going to use Hysol and glue those in place. Now you're making sure that number one, the hinge line is over top of the hinge line of the surface, and then you're checking the depth to make sure they're as even as possible between the actual two surfaces. All right, guys, so horns have been glued in place. Definitely not stingy with the Hysol, and really happy with these results. So what you can do is take a square at this point and run it across the surface, which is flat, and you can see that there is a zero gap up and down. So everything worked out really well. I've talked about this before in my other videos, but you want to put a tape joint around there, and then once you're happy with the position, peel the tape off, and you'll end up with a nice joint that you can paint, or it doesn't need to be painted because it's nice and tight. So rudders effectively are done, other than doing the control horn lengths, which we will get done up, but those are already pre-made, so fairly simple. All right, guys, we're moving on to the engine install. So we measure the widest point between the mounting hardware, or the clamp hardware, and we're at about 130 millimeters. And what I've done is marked on the rails 130 millimeters in between my paint lines there. So basically carried the lines same top and bottom. So if we get rid of these tabs, leave the white, the engine should slip in there just beautifully. So next thing we're going to do is Dremel these things out, and that's going to be a fair bit of sawdust created, but that is what we need to do to get the engines installed and aligned. This is going in the video, you know that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right, guys. So we're having a party here, assembling this F18 or F15. Anyways, we got the rails sanded out, so that's all fine and dandy. We've got enough space for the turbines to mount. So what we need to do is figure out number one, the spacing on the back. So if you look at the way the pipe's made up, we've got our little extension here. The heat pipe, or the inner pipe, sits on the inside about a centimeter. So the whole point of it being laid out like this is so it acts like a venturi and pulls air through the separation in the pipes. So the outside pipe stays fairly cool. So what we want to do is we want to run the outside pipe just past this former in the tail cone. So what we do is measure like this, because this part sits flush against the fuselage, and we're at 172 millimeters to be just past the former. So then what we've done is we've measured from here, 172 millimeters. It doesn't look right because the pipe's sitting at an angle, but our pipe's sitting at the right spot. And then we came forward, measured the distance roughly between the edge of the pipe and the tail cone of the turbine, and we ended up with our first mounting holes. Now we're using wood screws. Before you chastise me for not using blind nuts, remember, it's okay. There's a lot of ways to accomplish the exact same thing. I'm a fan of using wood screws. They work amazingly well, and there's zero issues with it. So that's what we're going to use to mount the turbines in. And what else? So with the Kingtech turbine that's going in here, or turbines, we've got adjustment on the engine mount compared to the engine. So we've centered the mount in the engine. We've got about 8 millimeters on both sides of the clamp. And once this actually gets mounted, of course, we can adjust the engines fore and aft to get perfect spacing between the pipe. But just keep that in mind when you mount your engines. So next thing we're doing is drilling these 2 holes first. We'll get the engine mounted, make sure we're happy with it, and then we'll drill those other 2 holes, and we'll repeat the exact same thing on the other side. All right, guys, first engine is mounted. So we did these first 2 screws, had some adjustment, and was able to play with the engine and get it positioned nicely. So I am a big fan of using eyes. If I had the technology and lasers and beams and all that fancy stuff, I might use that too. But if you use your eyes for things, they do an amazing job of getting things lined up. So if I hold, and your camera may not be in the center, but if I hold my head right in the middle of this circle and you're looking at the outside of the cone and it is perfectly even, we know that the engine is pointed back towards the center of the opening. Other thing we can do, and what I already did, was hold the exhaust pipe up there against the engine, center the exhaust pipe in this former work, and you can again verify that the engine is in fact pointing directly backwards. So now with one engine mounted, we can work on the other side. All right, guys, so my goal here is to try and show you what I'm talking about with centering the turbine. So I've got one bolt attached into the turbine, holding it on the rails. Now I've got the pipe sitting against the back of the turbine. I've got the pipe roughly centered in the back outlet of the fuselage. Now if we put our head right in the center of this pipe and you look on the top right hand side of the turbine exhaust cone, so roughly around 1:30 to 2 o'clock, you'll see that we can see a lot less of the turbine wheel than if we look at the 7 and 8 o'clock position, where you can see more of the turbine wheel. So what we need to do to center that in the pipe is we need to take that cone or the whole turbine and twist it up towards the 1 to 2 o'clock position. So I'll do that now, and I'll show you guys the result after doing that. All right, so I've adjusted the turbine. Now what I'll do is I'll get the cone or the pipe line back up. All right, now it's very likely we may have gone too far, but we'll see. So now if I put my head in the middle of the exhaust pipe, the spacing all around the cone to the turbine wheel, oh, our pipe's dropping down. Anyways, looks a lot better, and it is what we are looking for. So anyways, guys, that is my goal with the channel, is to try and share this knowledge with you guys. Don't fear trusting your eyes. They do amazing things, unless you're really old or have really bad eyes, but you know what I'm saying. Don't take what I'm saying out of context. But trust your eyes, and they can do amazing things with positioning and just making sure things look plumb level square. So I'm going to double check the position of the turbine, and then I'm going to drill the holes for this other turbine. All right, so because these are used turbines, the previous owner had elongated or oversized the mounting holes. So there's actually some play in there with the screws. So all I do at this point, and you can see it on this other side, the first one we did, is I just take my paint marker and I'm just going to trace around the mounting plates so we know exactly where we need to return them to. And I did the same thing on this side. And I also put some thin CA in the screw holes, and that's going to stiffen up the mounting screw positions. So I'm going to do the same thing on this other side. And so just take the paint marker, trace around it. And then when we put this turbine back in, we just make sure it's nice and centered in that mark, which means that everything will be lined up properly again. All right, guys, that is going to be everything for the very first episode of the F15 build. Man, that thing is cool looking. So just to recap, we got the rudders finished in this episode. Vertical stabs, sorry. We got the engines, engine rails mounted. We got the engines mounted, engine mounting figured out. And so quite a few good steps were accomplished in this video. Next thing we're going to be focusing on is finishing up the tail section install. So what that means is basically getting the pipe mounting system all figured out. I don't think it's going to be very hard, but we didn't get the some of the vertical pieces for the pipe mounting, so we're going to have to create our own systems to mount that stuff up. And then basically, once we're done the pipe mounting, we're going to focus on the elevator mounting and elevator system. So that might be the next video and video number 2. But anyways, guys, thanks so much for tuning into my channel, and thank you for watching the F15 build. This is going to be a fun build. It's should go fairly quickly, but looking forward to building this rest of this plane, doing the maiden flight on this plane. That's going to be tons of fun, and it's lots of fun. I love building these things. This is part of, I love flying them, but I also love building these models as well. It's a huge positive for me, and I look forward to it every single day I get to do it. So thanks guys for supporting the channel. If this is your first time finding my channel, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. It's a huge help to the channel. Hit that subscribe button down below when you do so. Don't forget to hit the bell so you get notified when I release new videos. If you don't do that, then you don't get notified when the new videos are released. So that's it, guys. Check out the website if you have time. There's a link down below. And we'll see you guys in the next episode where we cover the next steps on building the FB Jets F15. Thanks, guys.